Listen carefully, lady. I don't care what your little ticket says. You're moving to the back right now, or I'll have you dragged off this aircraft in handcuffs.
The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Captain Derek Blake stood over seat 2A, his finger pointed directly at the woman sitting calmly below him. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been challenged in 28 years of flying. His uniform was crisp, 4 gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders, and his jaw was set in the kind of rigid determination that comes from absolute certainty in one's power. The woman in the seat didn't flinch. She looked up at him with steady brown eyes, her expression unreadable. She wore a faded navy Yale hoodie, the kind you might find at a thrift store with frayed cuffs that had seen better years. Her jeans were worn but clean, and her canvas sneakers had scuff marks that spoke of regular use rather than designer distressing. Everything about her appearance suggested someone who had scraped together enough money for a first-class ticket and was now being told she didn't deserve it. What Captain Blake didn't know was that in exactly 18 minutes, the quiet woman he was threatening would destroy everything he had worked 28 years to build. And it would all happen in front of 312 passengers, 3 news cameras, and 47 million people watching live on social media. Zara Mitchell sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She had been in situations like this before, though never quite this public. The stares of other first-class passengers burned into her back. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their leather seats and avoiding eye contact. Others seemed curious, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. A few appeared satisfied, as if order was finally being restored to their exclusive domain. Sir Zara said quietly, her voice carrying a calm dignity that somehow made Blake's shouting seem even more inappropriate. "I have a valid boarding pass for this seat. Summit Airlines Flight SA892, Seat 2A. Perhaps there's been some confusion." Blake's face reddened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who looked like her. In his mind, first class was for first-class people. People who belonged. People who dressed the part and knew their place in the natural order of things. This woman, with her casual clothes and quiet demeanor, represented everything wrong with modern air travel. Standards had fallen. Rules were being bent, and it was his job, his duty to maintain some semblance of order. Confusion. Blake's voice rose another notch. "The only confusion here is how someone like you ended up in a seat that costs more than most people make in a month. Now I'm going to ask you one more time nicely to gather your belongings and move to the rear of the aircraft where you belong." The word belong hung in the air like poison. It was loaded with implications, assumptions, and centuries of history. Every passenger in first class understood exactly what Blake meant, even if they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge it openly. Jessica Hayes, the lead flight attendant, hovered nearby with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had seen this scenario play out before, though rarely with such public confrontation. Usually, these situations were handled more quietly with subtle suggestions and polite redirections. But Captain Blake had never been known for subtlety. His approach was direct, forceful, and effective. At least it had been effective until now. Captain Blake Jessica said softly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately in the galley." Blake waved her off without looking away from Zara. "No need for privacy, Jessica. This is simple. We have a passenger who doesn't belong in first class, and she's going to move. End of discussion." From Seat 3C. Amanda Foster watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. She was a marketing executive who flew Summit Airlines regularly, and she had never witnessed anything quite like this. Her phone was already in her hand, recording discreetly. She had a following on social media, mostly professional contacts and college friends, but she knew injustice when she saw it. And this felt like injustice. Tyler Morrison, a junior flight attendant with barely 6 months on the job, stood frozen in the galley entrance. Everything in his training told him to support his captain and senior crew members. but everything in his conscience told him this was wrong. The woman in 2A had done nothing disruptive. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't caused a scene, hadn't violated any policy he could think of. She was simply sitting in her assigned seat, holding a valid boarding pass and being told she didn't belong. My aircraft, my rules. Blake continued, his voice now loud enough for passengers in economy to hear. I determine who flies and where they sit. And I'm telling you that you need to move. Now. Zara looked past Blake to the gate area visible through the aircraft windows. She could see her head of security, David Torres, sitting in a black SUV in the parking structure, monitoring the situation through an encrypted app on his phone. One text message from her would bring him running. One phone call would mobilize lawyers, executives, and crisis management teams. But she wanted to see how far this would go. She needed to understand exactly what kind of culture existed in the airline she had quietly acquired 6 weeks ago. Captain Zara said, her voice still calm, but carrying a note of steel that Blake was too angry to recognize. I suggest you check your passenger manifest and company policies before you make your next move. Some decisions can't be undone. Blake laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. Are you threatening me? Are you actually threatening a commercial airline captain in front of all these witnesses? The irony was lost on him completely. He was the one making threats, issuing ultimatums, and wielding his authority like a weapon. But in his mind, he was simply doing his job, maintaining order, keeping standards high. The woman in 2A was the problem, not him. I'm simply suggesting caution, Zara replied. Actions have consequences, Captain Blake. And this moment right now will have consequences for everyone involved. From seat 24, B in economy. Carmen Rodriguez craned her neck to see what was happening in first class. She held her 2-year-old daughter, Sophia, against her chest, trying to keep the toddler calm as the tension in the cabin grew palpable. Carmen was a social worker flying to Miami for her sister's wedding, and she recognized the dynamics at play. This wasn't about seating assignments or airline policies. This was about power prejudice and the assumption that some people simply didn't deserve to be treated with basic human dignity. Blake's radio crackled to life. Captain Blake, we're ready for pushback when you are. Tower has us cleared for an 11:15 departure. Blake keyed his radio without taking his eyes off Zara. Ground control. We have a passenger situation that needs to be resolved before departure. Stand by. The announcement rippled through the cabin. Passengers checked their phones, worried about missed connections and delayed meetings. Some began to grumble about the holdup. Blake smiled, grimly satisfied that the pressure was building exactly as he intended. You see that, Blake said to Zara. You're now holding up 312 people. Their delays, their missed connections, their ruined plans, that's all on you. Still feeling stubborn, Zara met his gaze steadily. Captain Blake, you're the one creating this delay. You're the one turning a simple seating arrangement into a public spectacle. And you're the one who will be held accountable for what happens next. Blake's patience finally snapped completely. He reached for his radio again. Airport security to gate A17. We need assistance with a non-compliant passenger on Summit Airlines 892. Possible arrest situation. The words arrest situation sent a shockwave through the cabin. Passengers turned in their seats. Phones appeared from pockets and purses, and the low murmur of conversation died to absolute silence. Everyone was watching now. Everyone was listening. And many were recording. Amanda Foster raised her phone higher, no longer trying to be discreet. Her live stream app was open, viewer count climbing steadily as word spread through social media that something dramatic was happening on Summit Airlines Flight SA 892. Tyler Morrison finally found his voice. Captain, perhaps we should... Perhaps you should remember who's in charge here, Blake snapped, cutting the young flight attendant off mid-sentence. Either support your crew or find another job. The threat hung in the air, another display of the power Blake wielded so casually. But power Zara reflected silently was often just an illusion. And illusions had a way of shattering when exposed to the harsh light of truth. As if summoned by Blake's radio call, heavy footsteps echoed up the jet bridge. Airport security was coming, and the situation was about to escalate far beyond anyone's expectations. To understand the full magnitude of what was about to unfold on Flight SA-892, you need to know who Zara Mitchell really was. The woman sitting quietly in seat 2A, being threatened with arrest for the crime of existing while black in first class, wasn't just another passenger. She was worth $12. $4 billion, owned a conglomerate that employed over 180,000 people worldwide, and had spent the last 6 weeks as the anonymous new owner of Summit Airlines. Zara's story began 42 years earlier in Detroit, in a neighborhood where airplane contrails overhead represented dreams that seemed impossibly out of reach. She was raised by her grandmother, Essie Mitchell, a woman who cleaned office buildings at night and took in ironing during the day to make ends meet. Essie never let Zara forget that intelligence was her ticket out, but dignity was what she needed to hold on to along the way. Baby girl Essie used to say while pressing white shirts that belonged to executives downtown, "You can't control how people see you when they first look, but you can control how they remember you when you leave." Zara carried that lesson through a full scholarship to Yale, where she studied computer science while working 3 part-time jobs. She was often the only black student in her classes, frequently mistaken for a cafeteria worker or janitor by professors and classmates who couldn't imagine her as their intellectual equal. But she had learned early to let her work speak louder than her words. At 24, she founded her first technology company with $5,000 borrowed against her grandmother's house. The software she developed revolutionized supply chain management for small businesses, and 3 years later she sold the company for $47 million. It was enough to pay off Essie's mortgage, buy her a new house, and launch the investment empire that would become Skyline Aviation Group. But money, Zara learned, didn't automatically buy respect. The more successful she became, the more frequently she encountered situations like this one. Hotel clerks who assumed she was in the wrong lobby. Restaurant hostesses who suggested she might be more comfortable elsewhere. Airport security agents who questioned whether her first-class boarding pass was legitimate. Each incident taught her something about power prejudice and the gap between who people expected to see and who actually stood before them. She began to understand that real change didn't happen from a distance. You couldn't reform an industry from a corporate boardroom if you didn't understand what happened on the front lines. That's why she had made the decision to acquire Summit Airlines in the first place. The company was struggling financially, hemorrhaging passengers due to a reputation for poor service and discrimination complaints. But Zara saw potential in the routes, the infrastructure, and most importantly, the opportunity to prove that an airline could be both profitable and principled. The acquisition had been handled through a series of shell companies and private equity firms, keeping her identity hidden from Summit's management and employees. She wanted 6 months to observe the operation from within to understand exactly what needed to be changed and who needed to be replaced. Today's flight was supposed to be a simple test. Book a ticket under her own name dress like an average passenger and see how she was treated by Summit's crew. She had hoped for professional service, maybe even friendliness. What she was getting instead was a masterclass in corporate discrimination delivered by Captain Derek Blake with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Blake himself was a case study in institutional arrogance. At 51, he had spent nearly 3 decades in commercial aviation, working his way up from regional carriers to major airlines. He took pride in his perfect safety record, his on-time performance, and what he called his no-nonsense approach to passenger management. What Blake called no-nonsense, however, others might recognize as barely concealed prejudice. His personnel file, which Zara had reviewed during the acquisition due diligence, contained 2 formal complaints for discriminatory behavior and multiple informal reports of passenger incidents involving minorities, women traveling alone, and anyone else who didn't match his narrow definition of appropriate first-class clientele. The complaints had been dismissed or settled quietly buried in legal files where they couldn't damage Blake's career or the airline's reputation. But patterns of behavior had a way of revealing themselves, especially when someone was watching with the right perspective and sufficient authority to act on what they observed. In seat 24, B. Carmen Rodriguez was having her own moment of recognition. As a social worker in New York's Family Services Department, she had seen this exact dynamic play out countless times in different settings. The person with official authority using that power to humiliate someone they deemed unworthy. The quiet dignity of the victim refusing to be broken by the assault on their character. The uncomfortable silence of bystanders who knew something was wrong but felt powerless to intervene. Carmen had saved for 8 months to afford this trip to Miami for her sister's wedding. The economy ticket had stretched her budget to its limit, but family was family, and some occasions required sacrifice. Her daughter Sophia was fussy today, teething and uncomfortable in the unfamiliar environment. But even through her own stress, Carmen couldn't ignore what was happening in first class. She had her phone out too, recording what she could see from her position. Not for social media fame or viral video potential, but because documentation was protection. As a social worker, she had learned that without evidence, injustice became just another story that people could choose to believe or dismiss. Amanda Foster in seat 3C had her own reasons for paying attention. As a marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company, she understood brand reputation and the speed with which corporate disasters could unfold in the social media age. She had 8,000 followers on various platforms, mostly professional contacts and college friends. Her content usually focused on business travel tips, industry insights, and the occasional personal update. But this felt different. This felt important. Her live stream had started with just a few viewers, but the numbers were climbing steadily as people shared the link. The comments were pouring in faster than she could read them, a mix of outraged support and demands for more information about the airline and the captain involved. Tyler Morrison, frozen in the galley entrance, was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. At 26, this was his first real job after college, and he had been thrilled to land a position with a major airline. The training had been extensive, covering everything from safety procedures to customer service excellence. But nowhere in that training had they addressed what to do when your captain was publicly humiliating a passenger for no legitimate reason. Tyler could see the woman's boarding pass from where he stood. It was legitimate. The seat was hers. She had done nothing wrong except fail to meet Captain Blake's apparent expectations about who belonged in first class. Every instinct told Tyler to speak up, to say something, to do something. But he also knew that Blake had the power to end his career with a single negative evaluation. Jessica Hayes, the lead flight attendant, was performing a careful balancing act of her own. She had worked for Summit Airlines for 8 years, long enough to understand the unwritten rules of passenger management. Keep the VIPs happy, avoid complaints from influential travelers, and maintain plausible deniability when situations turned ugly. She had seen Blake handle problems before, usually with more subtlety than he was displaying today. The typical approach involved quiet conversations, policy explanations that may or may not have been accurate, and gentle pressure that encouraged passengers to comply without making a scene. But Blake seemed determined to make this confrontation as public and humiliating as possible. Jessica knew this was wrong. She also knew that challenging Blake directly would accomplish nothing except ending her own career. So she stood by, offering weak attempts at de-escalation while secretly hoping someone else would intervene before the situation spiraled completely out of control. What none of them knew was that David Torres, Zara's head of security, was monitoring the entire situation from the black SUV parked in the airport structure. Torres had spent 15 years in military intelligence before joining Zara's team, and he understood the value of patience and preparation. His encrypted communication app showed Zara's status as Condition Yellow, watchful but not yet ready for extraction. Torres had teams positioned throughout the airport legal council on standby and crisis management protocols ready to activate at a moment's notice. But Zara had been clear in her instructions: let it play out until she gave the signal. She needed to see exactly how far Summit Airlines would go in their treatment of passengers who didn't meet their apparent standards. The irony was perfect and brutal. The woman being threatened with arrest was the owner of the company whose employees were threatening her. The passenger being told she didn't belong owned the aircraft, the route, the gate, and every uniform in sight. The person being judged by her appearance had the power to fire everyone involved with a single phone call. But Zara wasn't interested in dramatic reveals or instant gratification. She wanted documentation. She wanted witnesses. She wanted an incident so clear and undeniable that nobody could later claim it was just a misunderstanding or blown out of proportion. The heavy footsteps in the jet bridge were getting closer. Airport security was almost there, ready to arrest a woman for the crime of sitting in her assigned seat while failing to look like she belonged there. In just a few minutes, the situation would escalate beyond anything anyone had imagined. And through it all, Zara Mitchell sat quietly in seat 2, her expression calm and her conscience clear. She had learned long ago that sometimes you had to let people reveal exactly who they were before you could show them who you were. Today's lesson was about to begin. The security officers who stepped onto Flight SA-892 represented two different approaches to authority and justice. Officer Patricia Santos had been working LaGuardia Airport security for 12 years, long enough to recognize when a situation felt wrong, even if she couldn't immediately identify why. Officer James Mitchell was newer to the job, but eager to please, particularly when dealing with airline personnel who could make his career either easier or much more difficult. Captain Blake greeted them with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having his word accepted without question. "Officers, thank you for responding quickly. We have a passenger in first class who's refusing to comply with crew instructions. She's disrupting the flight and needs to be removed from the aircraft." Santos looked toward seat 2A, where Zara sat calmly with her hands folded in her lap. The woman didn't look disruptive. She wasn't raising her voice, making threatening gestures, or exhibiting any of the behaviors Santos typically associated with problematic passengers. If anything, she appeared remarkably composed for someone facing potential arrest. "Ma'am," Santos said, approaching Zara's seat with professional courtesy. "I'm Officer Santos with Airport Security. Can you tell me what's happening here?" "Certainly." "Officer Santos," Zara replied, her voice steady and clear. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat with a valid boarding pass. Captain Blake has ordered me to move to economy class to make room for what he calls a priority passenger. I've explained that I paid full price for this seat and have done nothing to warrant being moved, but he's insisted on calling security." Santos examined Zara's boarding pass and identification. Everything appeared legitimate. The seat was assigned to Zara Mitchell. The ticket was paid for, and there were no flags in the airline's computer system indicating any problems with the passenger or the reservation. Captain Blake Santos said, turning back to the pilot, "Can you explain the specific policy violation or safety concern that requires this passenger to be moved?" Blake's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to having his authority questioned by security officers, especially in front of passengers who were recording every word. "Officer, this is an operational decision. As captain of this aircraft, I have the authority to determine seating arrangements based on the needs of the flight. But what specific need requires this passenger to move?" Santos pressed. "She appears to be complying with all safety regulations, her ticket is valid, and she hasn't exhibited any disruptive behavior." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Blake realized he was being asked to articulate something he had never had to justify before. His assumption that certain people simply didn't belong in first class, regardless of their ability to pay for it. "We have a VIP passenger boarding who requires this specific seat," Blake said finally. "Mr. Marcus Thornfield is a platinum-level frequent flyer with special accommodations. Company policy requires us to prioritize his seating preferences." It was a lie, and everyone in the cabin seemed to sense it. Summit Airlines had no such policy. VIP passengers might receive upgrades when space was available, but they couldn't displace confirmed passengers from their assigned seats without significant compensation and voluntary agreement. Amanda Foster's live stream was now reaching over 3,000 viewers, with comments flooding in faster than she could read them. The story was spreading through social media like wildfire, shared by aviation enthusiasts, civil rights advocates, and ordinary people who recognized injustice when they saw it. "This is insane," read one comment. "Call the news station," suggested another. "Someone identify this pilot," demanded a third. Tyler Morrison watched from the galley with growing horror as the situation spiraled out of control. He had looked up the policy Blake was citing, and it didn't exist. More importantly, he could see Marcus Thornfield approaching the aircraft entrance, clearly intoxicated and loudly complaining about the delay. Thornfield pushed past Tyler without acknowledgement, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his breath reeking of alcohol from whatever VIP lounge he had been inhabiting. At 48, he was the kind of entitled businessman who treated service workers as furniture and believed his wealth granted him the right to absolute deference. Blake Thornfield called out loudly, his voice slurred but demanding. "What's the holdup? I've got meetings in Miami that can't be delayed for whatever drama you're dealing with up here." Blake's face flushed with embarrassment at Thornfield's obvious intoxication, but he pressed forward with his fabricated explanation. "Mr. Thornfield, we have a seating issue that we're resolving. This passenger was incorrectly placed in your preferred seat. My preferred seat." Thornfield swayed slightly as he looked toward 2A. "You mean someone's actually in my seat? Well, get them out. I pay premium prices for premium service not to deal with." He gestured dismissively at Zara, letting the implication hang without completing the sentence. Officer Mitchell stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable, but feeling pressure to support the airline's position. "Ma'am, if you would just cooperate and move to the alternative seat, we can resolve this situation quickly." "No," Zara said simply. The word was quiet but absolute. No, Blake's voice rose to a near shout. "You're refusing a direct instruction from airport security. I'm refusing an illegal request to give up a seat I paid for, so that an intoxicated passenger can sit where he wants instead of where he's ticketed." Zara replied, her calm tone, making Blake's agitation seem even more inappropriate. Santos was reviewing the boarding manifest on her handheld device. "Mr. Thornfield, according to this passenger list, your assigned seat is 3A, not 2A. There doesn't appear to be any documentation supporting your claim to this seat." Thornfield waved dismissively. "Documentation? I've been flying Summit Airlines for 20 years. Blake knows I always prefer the window seat in the first row. It's an understanding we have." "An understanding isn't the same as a reservation," Santos pointed out. "And sir, I have to ask, have you been drinking today?" The question hit Thornfield like a slap. He straightened up, trying to project sobriety through sheer force of will. "I resent the implication. Officer, I'm a respected businessman with important commitments. A drink or two in the VIP lounge hardly makes me unfit to fly." Carmen Rodriguez, still watching from economy, felt her heart racing as she witnessed the injustice unfolding. Sophia had finally fallen asleep in her arms, but Carmen couldn't tear herself away from the scene. She had her phone out, recording what she could see, adding her voice to the growing chorus of documentation. "This isn't right," she murmured to the passenger next to her. "They're trying to force her out of her seat for a drunk white man who thinks he's entitled to whatever he wants." The passenger nodded grimly. "Airlines do this all the time. They just usually don't make it so obvious." Blake, sensing that his authority was slipping away, decided to escalate dramatically. "Officers, this passenger is clearly being disruptive and non-compliant. I'm requesting her immediate removal from the aircraft under federal aviation regulations regarding passenger interference with crew instructions." "What specific crew instruction has she violated?" Santos asked her patience clearly, wearing thin. "The instruction to move to her proper seat," Blake replied. "But this is her proper seat," Santos pointed out, holding up the boarding pass. "You're asking her to move to accommodate an intoxicated passenger who isn't even ticketed for this seat." Blake's face was now bright red with fury and embarrassment. He had expected automatic compliance from security, unquestioning support for his authority as captain. Instead, he was being questioned, challenged, and made to look foolish in front of a cabin full of recording passengers. "Officer, let me be very clear," Blake said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "I am the captain of this aircraft. My authority is absolute when it comes to flight safety and passenger management. This woman is refusing lawful crew instructions, and I want her arrested for interference with a flight crew." The federal charge Blake was threatening carried serious penalties, fines up to $35,000 and potential jail time. It was designed to protect airline crews from genuine threats and disruptions, not to enforce a captain's personal prejudices about who belonged in first class. Santos looked at her partner, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. Mitchell shrugged, suggesting he was ready to follow Blake's lead rather than challenge an airline captain's authority. "Ma'am Santos," said to Zara, making one final attempt at de-escalation, "would you be willing to accept an upgrade to business class on a future flight in exchange for moving to seat 3B today? It would help us resolve this situation without anyone facing charges." Zara looked at Santos with something approaching pity. "Officer Santos, what you're asking me to do is reward discrimination and enable a pattern of behavior that makes air travel humiliating and dangerous for people who look like me. I won't do that." "Then you're under arrest," Blake declared triumphantly, gesturing to Mitchell. "Officer, place her in custody for interference with a flight crew." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the order. But the pressure from Blake, the weight of official authority, and his own inexperience combined to override his instincts. He reached for his handcuffs. "Ma'am, please stand up and place your hands behind your back," Mitchell said, his voice lacking conviction. The cabin fell completely silent. Amanda Foster adjusted her phone to capture the moment clearly, her viewer count now exceeding 5,000 people. Comments were exploding with outrage, disbelief, and demands for justice. "This is America. In 2024, Zara said as she slowly stood, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Everyone is watching. Everyone is recording. And everyone will remember this moment." Mitchell fastened the flex cuffs around Zara's wrists, the plastic restraints clicking shut with a sound that seemed to echo through the cabin. She stood with dignity intact, her head high, her expression calm, despite the humiliation being inflicted on her. Thornfield clapped slowly, mockingly. Finally, some sense. Maybe now we can get this flight moving, and I can conduct my business in peace. Blake nodded with satisfaction. Sometimes people need to learn their place the hard way. This flight will depart on time and proper order will be maintained. But even as he spoke the words, Blake felt a nagging uncertainty. The woman's composure was unnerving. Her confidence seemed unshaken by her arrest, and there was something in her final statement about everyone watching that suggested consequences he hadn't considered. From economy, Carmen Rodriguez stood up despite Sophia sleeping in her arms. "This is wrong," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "You can't arrest someone for sitting in their assigned seat." Other passengers began to murmur agreement. Phones were out throughout the cabin now, recording from multiple angles. The mood was shifting from uncomfortable observation to active disapproval. "Ma'am, sit down or you'll be removed as well," Blake warned Carmen. For what? speaking the truth. This woman has done nothing wrong, and you know it. Tyler Morrison finally found his courage. Captain, perhaps we should reconsider. Perhaps you should remember who signs your evaluations. Blake cut him off sharply. But the damage was spreading beyond Blake's ability to control. Amanda Foster's live stream was being shared rapidly across platforms. Carmen Rodriguez's sister in Miami was already calling local news stations. Passengers throughout the cabin were uploading videos to their social media accounts with hashtags like Summit Scandal and Airline Discrimination. The moment that was supposed to demonstrate Blake's authority and restore order to his aircraft had instead created a viral documentation of corporate discrimination. And in the black SUV in the parking structure, David Torres watched the feeds with growing concern as his encrypted app showed Zara's status changing from condition yellow to condition red. It was time to reveal exactly who was really in charge of Flight SA-892. The transformation from isolated incident to global viral moment happened with the terrifying speed that only social media could deliver. Amanda Foster's live stream had started with a handful of viewers, but as the situation escalated, the viewer count climbed exponentially. 5,000 became 10,000, then 15,000, then 25,000 people watching in real time as Zara Mitchell stood in handcuffs, arrested for the crime of sitting in her assigned seat while black. Amanda's commentary was professional but clearly outraged. I'm broadcasting live from Summit Airlines Flight SA-892 at LaGuardia Airport, where I'm witnessing what appears to be clear racial profiling. A black woman has just been arrested for refusing to give up her first-class seat to an intoxicated white passenger who isn't even ticketed for that seat. The comments section exploded with responses, "This is 2024. Seriously? Someone call the news stations now. What airline is this? I'm never flying them again. That pilot needs to be fired immediately. This woman needs a lawyer. Please tell me someone is recording this." Amanda's phone wasn't the only device capturing the incident. Carmen Rodriguez in economy had her camera focused on the first-class section, her social worker instincts compelling her to document what she recognized as institutional abuse. Her sister Maria in Miami was watching the live stream that Carmen had started, simultaneously sharing it across her own networks and calling local news stations. Mira Maria Carmen whispered into her phone in Spanish, "Estoy viendo una injusticia horrible aquí. Esta mujer no hizo nada malo." Throughout the cabin, at least a dozen passengers were recording from different angles. The incident was being captured in high definition from multiple perspectives, creating an undeniable record that no amount of corporate spin could later dispute. Tyler Morrison, the junior flight attendant, watched in horror as his first real job turned into a career-ending nightmare. He pulled out his personal phone and began recording as well, not for social media distribution, but as potential evidence for whatever investigation would inevitably follow. His hands shook as he held the device, realizing he was documenting his captain's career suicide. The hashtag Summit Scandal began trending within minutes, picked up by aviation industry observers, civil rights advocates, and ordinary people who were appalled by what they were witnessing. Airline discrimination and LaGuardia arrest joined the viral conversation, spreading the incident across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook simultaneously. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a civil rights attorney who happened to follow Amanda Foster's marketing content, was among the live stream viewers. She immediately began recording screenshots and documenting the incident for potential legal action, recognizing the multiple federal violations occurring in real time. "This is textbook discrimination," she typed in the comments. "Federal aviation law, civil rights violations, false arrest. This airline is facing massive liability." Her comment was liked and shared hundreds of times within minutes, adding legal context to the growing outrage. Captain Blake remained oblivious to the digital storm building around him. In his mind, he had restored order to his aircraft and demonstrated the consequences of challenging his authority. The fact that dozens of passengers were recording the incident didn't concern him. He was confident that his actions were justified and that any investigation would support his decisions. Marcus Thornfield settled into seat 2A with obvious satisfaction, ordering a double whiskey before the flight had even pushed back from the gate. His entitlement was so complete that he seemed genuinely unaware of the moral catastrophe unfolding around him. Finally, he said loudly to Jessica Hayes, some professional service, "I was starting to wonder if Summit Airlines had forgotten how to treat their premium customers." Jessica's smile was strained to the breaking point. She could see the phones recording throughout the cabin, could sense the shifting mood of the passengers, and knew instinctively that this situation was spiraling far beyond anyone's control. But her training and job security demanded that she support her captain's decisions no matter how uncomfortable they made her. Officer Santos was experiencing her own crisis of conscience. 20 years of law enforcement had taught her to recognize when an arrest was legitimate and when it was simply an abuse of power. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The passenger's calm demeanor, the lack of any actual violation, the captain's obvious personal animosity, and the drunk businessman who seemed to be the real beneficiary of the arrest. Ma'am Santos said quietly to Zara, "I want you to know that you have the right to remain silent and anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford one, one will be provided for you." Zara nodded calmly. "Thank you, Officer Santos. I appreciate your professionalism in a situation that clearly makes you uncomfortable." The statement carried an implicit criticism of everyone else involved, delivered with such grace that it somehow made Blake's brutality seem even more inappropriate by contrast. Santos continued reading the Miranda rights while internally questioning everything about the arrest she was facilitating. Her partner, Officer Mitchell, seemed more confident in Blake's authority, but Santos noticed that even he appeared uncomfortable with the situation. Meanwhile, David Torres in the parking structure was coordinating a response that Blake couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. Torres had teams of lawyers, crisis management specialists, and corporate executives on standby, all monitoring the viral spread of the incident and preparing for immediate action. The encrypted communication app on Torres's phone showed messages flooding in from Skyline Aviation Group's various departments, legal multiple federal violations documented. Preparing immediate injunctions, PR story trending globally. Major news outlets requesting statements, HR background checks on all involved personnel complete. Termination paperwork ready. Operations replacement crew standing by. New captain en route. Torres typed a message to Zara's account. "Ready to proceed. Your signal initiates full response." Zara felt her phone buzz with the encrypted message, though her hands were restrained behind her back. She nodded almost imperceptibly toward the window where she knew Torres was watching. The viral momentum was building beyond anyone's ability to control. Amanda Foster's live stream had reached 30,000 concurrent viewers, with the recording being shared across platforms faster than anyone could track. Major news outlets were beginning to pick up the story, with CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC all assigning reporters to investigate the incident. Carmen Rodriguez's sister Maria had successfully contacted Univision and Telemundo, ensuring that the story would reach Spanish-speaking audiences throughout the country. The incident was becoming a national story in real time, far beyond the scope of a simple airline disruption. Aviation industry observers were particularly vocal in their criticism. Retired pilots, flight attendants, and airline executives used their social media platforms to condemn Blake's actions and predict severe consequences for both him and Summit Airlines. Captain Sarah Chen, a veteran pilot with 25 years of experience, posted a video response that quickly went viral. "What I just witnessed on that Summit Airlines flight is exactly what's wrong with our industry. No passenger should ever be treated that way, and that captain has disgraced the uniform we all wear." The Federal Aviation Administration's Social Media Monitoring Department flagged the incident for immediate investigation, triggering protocols that would result in Blake's pilot license being reviewed and potentially suspended. Civil rights organizations began issuing statements condemning the incident. The NAACP-ACLU and Southern Poverty Law Center all released press statements calling for immediate investigation and prosecution of everyone involved in the false arrest. But perhaps most damaging of all was the simple, clear documentation of injustice that resonated with ordinary people who had experienced similar discrimination in their own lives. The comments on the various video feeds told a story of widespread recognition. This happened to me at a restaurant last month. I've been questioned about my first-class ticket 3 times this year. They always assume we don't belong in premium spaces. When will this end? She handled that with more grace than I could have managed. The incident was becoming a symbol of broader patterns of discrimination that millions of people recognized from their own experiences. It wasn't just about one woman on one flight. It was about a culture of assumptions, prejudices, and power imbalances that played out in airports, hotels, restaurants, and corporate offices across the country. Tyler Morrison, watching the social media feeds on his phone, realized that he was witnessing a career-defining moment for everyone involved. Captain Blake's 28-year career was ending in real-time, broadcast live to tens of thousands of viewers and preserved forever in multiple recordings. Jessica Hayes was beginning to understand that her complicity in the incident would have lasting consequences for her own career. The airlines industry was small, and incidents like this followed people for years. Her decision to support Blake's actions, rather than speak up for what was right, would be remembered long after the immediate crisis passed. Marcus Thornfield, drunk and oblivious in his stolen seat, had no idea that his entitled behavior was being documented and shared across the internet. His name and face were being identified by social media users, with his business dealings and personal background being researched and exposed by thousands of outraged observers. The transformation was complete. What had started as an isolated incident of discrimination had become a global symbol of injustice, documented from multiple angles and shared across every social media platform. The story was spreading faster than anyone could contain it, and the consequences were building like an avalanche. In the black SUV, David Torres received the signal he had been waiting for. Zara's encrypted status changed to Condition Alpha, the authorization for full response. Torres stepped out of the vehicle, straightened his suit jacket, and began walking toward the aircraft. The revelation that would destroy some careers and transform an entire airline was about to begin. The heavy footsteps echoing up the jet bridge belonged to David Torres, but Captain Blake had no way of knowing that the approaching figure represented the end of everything he had built over 28 years in aviation. Torres moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling crises, carrying a leather briefcase that contained enough legal documentation to dismantle careers and corporate reputations. At 45, Torres had served 15 years in military intelligence before joining Zara Mitchell's security team. He understood the value of patience, preparation, and precise timing. For the past 18 minutes, he had watched the situation unfold through multiple live streams while coordinating with lawyers, executives, and crisis management teams. Now it was time to act. Blake greeted the approaching figure with irritation rather than concern. "Sir, this aircraft is secured for departure. If you're a passenger, you need to check in at the gate." Torres reached into his briefcase and produced a leather credential case, opening it to reveal his identification and corporate authorization. "I'm David Torres, head of security for Skyline Aviation Group. I need to speak with you immediately. Captain Blake." The name Skyline Aviation Group meant nothing to Blake, who was focused on maintaining control of what he still believed was a simple passenger removal situation. "I don't know what company you represent, sir, but we have an operational situation to resolve. This aircraft needs to depart." Captain Blake Torres said, his voice carrying an authority that made Blake pause. The operational situation you're referring to involves the arrest of my employer. I'm here to correct a significant misunderstanding. Officer Santos looked up with interest. She had been increasingly uncomfortable with the arrest and welcomed any development that might provide clarity to the confusing situation. Torres addressed Santos directly. Officer, I'm going to ask you to remove those restraints from Ms. Mitchell immediately. You've arrested the CEO and majority owner of Summit Airlines for sitting in her own aircraft. The words hung in the air like an explosion. Blake's face went white. Jessica Hayes took a step backward. Marcus Thornfield looked up from his whiskey with confused alarm. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had been recording suddenly realized they had captured something far more dramatic than a simple discrimination incident. "That's impossible," Blake stammered. "She's dressed like... She doesn't look like... I would have been notified if the owner was on my flight." Torres opened his briefcase and began producing documents. Ms. Zara Mitchell, CEO of Skyline Aviation Group, completed the acquisition of Summit Airlines 6 weeks ago. The purchase price was $2.8 billion. Every aircraft in your fleet, every route you fly, every paycheck you receive, all of it belongs to her. He handed a folder to Officer Santos, who opened it to find corporate documentation, ownership papers, and Zara's executive identification. The documents were official notarized and undeniably authentic. Ma'am Santos said to Zara, her voice filled with a mixture of embarrassment and concern, "I'm going to remove these restraints immediately. I apologize for this misunderstanding." As the flex cuffs were cut away, Zara rubbed her wrists gently and smiled at Santos. "Thank you, Officer Santos. You were simply doing your job based on the information you were given." The statement was gracious, but loaded with implication. Santos had been given false information by Blake, had acted on that false information, and had arrested an airline's owner based on a captain's personal prejudices rather than any legitimate policy violation. Blake's world was collapsing in real time. This can't be right. Nobody told me about new ownership. I haven't received any notifications about management changes. Because it was a private acquisition handled through shell companies, Torres explained. Ms. Mitchell wanted to observe the operation from a customer perspective before implementing changes. You've provided her with exactly the experience she was looking for. The irony was brutal and complete. Blake's discrimination had been performed not just in front of passengers and cameras, but directly against the woman who owned the company he worked for. His prejudices had led him to arrest his own employer. Marcus Thornfield, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake, tried to remove himself from seat 2A. "Listen, there's been a misunderstanding. I never asked to have anyone arrested. I was just trying to get to my assigned seat." Zara looked at him with calm assessment. "Mr. Thornfield, your assigned seat was 3A, not 2A. You supported Captain Blake's false arrest of me, so you could sit in a seat you weren't ticketed for. That choice will have consequences." Torres produced another document from his briefcase. "Mr. Thornfield, your corporate travel account with Skyline Aviation Group has been terminated. You're also permanently banned from all Skyline properties, including hotels, ground transportation, and aviation services." Thornfield's face went from confused to panicked. "You can't do that. I have business commitments, travel requirements. I spend millions of dollars annually on corporate travel." "You spent millions of dollars annually," Zara corrected. Past tense. "Your entitlement to other people's seats ended when you supported false arrest to get what you wanted." Amanda Foster's live stream was now reaching over 50,000 viewers, with the chat exploding in real-time reactions. "Plot twist of the century. She owns the airline. That pilot is so fired. Justice is about to be served. This is better than any movie." The viewer count continued climbing as word spread across social media platforms. The story was evolving from discrimination incident to corporate justice drama, with viewers sharing the stream faster than the platform could track. Captain Blake, desperate to salvage his career, tried a different approach. Miss Mitchell, if you are indeed the owner, then you'll understand that I was simply trying to maintain operational efficiency. Mr. Thornfield is a valued frequent flyer, and I thought... You thought that a black woman in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in first class. Zara interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying an edge of steel. You thought that your assumptions about who deserves respect were more important than federal aviation regulations and basic human dignity. Blake's mouth opened and closed without sound. For 28 years, his prejudices had been enabled and supported by airline management that prioritized customer appeasement over employee accountability. He had never faced consequences for his discrimination because victims rarely had the power to enforce those consequences. But this victim owned the airline. Jessica Hayes, realizing that her complicity would have lasting consequences, tried to distance herself from Blake's decisions. Ms. Mitchell, I was simply following the captain's instructions. As lead flight attendant, I'm required to support crew decisions. You were required to follow lawful instructions, Zara replied. Participating in false arrest based on racial discrimination was neither lawful nor required. You chose to enable Captain Blake's behavior rather than speak up for what was right. Torres consulted his tablet, which was receiving real-time updates from Skyline's legal and operations teams. Ms. Mitchell, we have replacement crew standing by. Captain Maria Santos from our Miami hub is en route to take command of this aircraft. She'll arrive within 30 minutes. The efficiency of the response demonstrated the resources that Zara could deploy when necessary. This wasn't a passenger complaint that would be handled through normal corporate channels. This was the company owner personally addressing discrimination within her organization with all the authority and resources that position commanded. Tyler Morrison, who had been watching in horrified fascination, finally found his voice. Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that I disagreed with Captain Blake's actions. I tried to speak up, but I was threatened with termination. Zara looked at the young flight attendant with something approaching sympathy. Tyler, your situation illustrates exactly what's wrong with the culture here. Employees who speak up for what's right shouldn't fear for their jobs. That culture changes today. Blake made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. Ma'am, I apologize if there was a misunderstanding about your status. Perhaps we can resolve this privately without involving terminations or legal action. The word misunderstanding seemed to hang in the air like an insult. There had been no misunderstanding. Blake had seen a black woman in casual clothes and assumed she didn't belong in first class. He had fabricated policies called for her arrest and supported discrimination because it aligned with his personal prejudices. Captain Blake, Zara said, standing and facing him directly. There was no misunderstanding. You arrested me because you couldn't imagine that someone who looks like me could afford first class. That wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. Torres produced termination paperwork that had been prepared while the incident unfolded. Captain Blake, your employment with Summit Airlines is terminated immediately. Your pilot's license will be flagged for FAA review due to passenger safety violations. Security will escort you from the aircraft. The termination was swift, final, and completely justified by Blake's own documented behavior. 28 years of flying hundreds of thousands of safe miles and a previously unblemished safety record, all ended by 18 minutes of revealed prejudice. Jessica Hayes received similar paperwork. Jessica, your termination is effective immediately. Your actions enabled discrimination and false arrest. That's grounds for immediate dismissal under federal employment law. Carmen Rodriguez, watching from economy, began to cry, not from sadness but from relief that justice was finally being served. Sophia stirred in her arms, awakened by her mother's emotional reaction. Is this really happening? Carmen whispered to herself. Is she really the owner? Torres addressed the cabin through the aircraft's public address system. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay and the disturbing incident you've witnessed. Summit Airlines does not tolerate discrimination in any form. The employees responsible have been terminated, and we're implementing immediate reforms to ensure this never happens again. The announcement triggered applause throughout the cabin. Passengers who had felt helpless while witnessing injustice suddenly realized they had documented a moment of corporate accountability that would have lasting impact. Blake and Jessica gathered their personal belongings under Torres's watchful supervision. Their careers in aviation were over. Their reputations destroyed by their own choices. The viral documentation of their behavior would follow them to any future employment opportunities. Marcus Thornfield, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the full scope of his own consequences. His business relied heavily on corporate travel, and Skyline Aviation Group controlled a significant portion of the routes and hotels his company used. The termination of his travel privileges would have cascading effects on his ability to conduct business. As Blake walked toward the aircraft exit escorted by security, Zara called out to him one final time. "Captain Blake," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "You taught me something important today. You showed me exactly what needs to change in this industry. Your legacy won't be 28 years of safe flying. It will be the catalyst for reform that ensures no passenger ever experiences what you put me through today." The words were delivered without anger or vindictiveness, but their impact was devastating. Blake had become the symbol of everything wrong with airline culture, and his behavior would be remembered long after his career was forgotten. The power reveal was complete. The quiet woman in the hoodie had revealed herself as the most powerful person in the room, and justice had been swift, decisive, and completely deserved. The termination of Captain Derek Blake and flight attendant Jessica Hayes triggered a cascade of consequences that rippled far beyond Flight SA-892. Within minutes of Torres's announcement, Skyline Aviation Group's crisis management protocols activated with the efficiency of a military operation, demonstrating the resources and authority that Zara Mitchell could deploy when her company's values were threatened. Torres coordinated the response from his position in the aircraft galley, his encrypted tablet displaying real-time updates from multiple departments. Legal team confirms federal violations documented, he announced to Zara. FAA has been notified of the incident. Replacement crew ETA 12 minutes. The legal implications were staggering. Blake's false arrest of Zara violated multiple federal statutes, including civil rights laws, aviation safety regulations, and corporate policy mandates. Each violation carried potential criminal charges and civil liability that would follow him long after his aviation career ended. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the civil rights attorney who had been watching Amanda Foster's live stream, was already drafting legal analyses for major news networks. "This is a textbook case of institutional discrimination," she posted on social media. "False arrest, civil rights violations, and corporate liability. The damages could reach tens of millions." Her assessment was shared thousands of times within minutes, adding legal context to the viral outrage and ensuring that the incident would be analyzed not just as entertainment, but as a serious legal and social justice issue. Captain Maria Santos arrived at the aircraft ahead of schedule, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere in the cabin. At 38, she was a veteran pilot with over 12,000 flight hours and a reputation for professionalism that stood in stark contrast to Blake's behavior. Her arrival symbolized more than just a crew change. It represented a fundamental shift in how Summit Airlines would operate under Zara's ownership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Santos announced over the aircraft's PA system, her voice calm and professional. "I'm Captain Maria Santos, and I'll be taking command of this flight. We apologize for the delay and the disturbing incident you witnessed. Summit Airlines is committed to treating every passenger with dignity and respect." The announcement triggered sustained applause throughout the cabin. Passengers who had felt helpless while witnessing injustice suddenly realized they had been part of something historic, the documentation of corporate accountability in real time. Amanda Foster ended her live stream with over 75,000 viewers, but not before making a statement that would be quoted in news reports for days afterward. "We've just witnessed something incredible. Not just discrimination being exposed, but justice being served immediately. This is what corporate accountability looks like when leadership has integrity." Her final viewer count reached 89,000 people, with the recording already being shared across every major social media platform. The hashtag Summit Scandal was trending globally, joined by Zara Mitchell Airline Justice and Digital Accountability. Carmen Rodriguez, still emotional from witnessing the justice she had rarely seen in her social work career, approached Zara as passengers began to settle back into their seats. "Ms. Mitchell, thank you. I see discrimination every day in my work, and victims rarely get to see their abusers face consequences. What you did today gives me hope." Zara smiled warmly at the young mother. Carmen justice shouldn't be rare or remarkable. It should be standard. That's what we're going to build together. The word "together" was intentional and loaded with meaning. Zara had been observing Carmen's quiet strength throughout the incident. Her willingness to speak up despite having no power or authority to enforce change. Those were exactly the qualities Zara wanted in her organization. Tyler Morrison, the junior flight attendant who had tried to speak up against Blake's behavior, approached nervously. "Ms. Mitchell, I want to apologize for not doing more to stop what happened. I was scared of losing my job, but that's no excuse." Zara replied, "You did try to speak up. You were threatened with termination for doing the right thing. That's exactly the culture we're going to change. Employees who stand up for justice should be promoted, not punished." She turned to Torres. "Make sure Tyler is enrolled in our management training program. We need leaders who choose courage over compliance." The announcement reached Tyler like a revelation. His career, which he had thought might be over due to his association with the incident, was instead being accelerated because of his moral courage. It was a clear signal that the new Summit Airlines would operate by different principles than the old one. Meanwhile, the consequences for Blake and Jessica were unfolding with brutal efficiency. Blake's pilot license was flagged for immediate FAA review, triggering an investigation that would examine not just today's incident but his entire career history. The two previous discrimination complaints that had been buried in legal files were being researched and re-examined. Jessica's termination was complicated by her union membership, but the video evidence of her participation in false arrest made any grievance process academic. No union could defend an employee who had enabled racial discrimination and supported illegal detention of passengers. Marcus Thornfield's consequences extended far beyond his banned travel status. His business partners were already receiving calls from reporters asking about their association with the entitled businessman who had supported false arrest to steal someone else's airplane seat. His real estate empire, built on relationships and reputation, was facing immediate damage that would take years to repair. The social media investigation of Thornfield's background had revealed a pattern of entitled behavior spanning decades. Former employees shared stories of discrimination and abuse. Business partners distanced themselves from his reputation. Clients began questioning whether they wanted to be associated with someone who had publicly supported racial profiling. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's legal analysis was being quoted on CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC, providing expert context for the millions of viewers who were learning about the incident through traditional media coverage. "This case will be studied in law schools for years," she predicted. "It's a perfect example of how social media documentation can enable real-time justice." The Federal Aviation Administration issued a statement within hours of the incident. "The FAA takes passenger safety and civil rights violations extremely seriously. We are conducting a full investigation of the incident on Summit Airlines Flight SA-892 and will pursue all appropriate regulatory and legal remedies." The statement was carefully worded but clearly indicated that Blake's career in aviation was over. Pilot licenses suspended for civil rights violations were rarely reinstated, and the public nature of his behavior made any appeal process virtually impossible. Skyline Aviation Group's stock price fluctuated wildly as news of the incident spread, initially dropping on fears of legal liability, before recovering as investors realized that Zara's decisive response had actually strengthened the company's reputation. The market was rewarding corporate accountability rather than punishing it. The incident was being covered by international media as well, with outlets in Europe, Asia, and South America using it as an example of American corporate culture and social progress. The speed of the consequences enabled by social media documentation was being analyzed as a new form of digital accountability that could reshape corporate behavior globally. Carmen Rodriguez received a call from Skyline's Human Resources Department before the flight even took off. Ms. Rodriguez, we understand you're a social worker with experience in discrimination cases. We'd like to discuss a position as Director of Passenger Advocacy. Would you be interested in hearing more? The offer was part of Zara's broader vision for transforming Summit Airlines. She wanted employees who understood injustice from personal experience, who could build policies and procedures that prevented discrimination rather than simply responding to it after the damage was done. I'm interested, Carmen replied, looking down at Sophia, who was finally sleeping peacefully. But I have a daughter. I'd need flexible arrangements. Ms. Mitchell anticipated that the HR representative replied. The position comes with on-site childcare, flexible scheduling, and full benefits. She believes that protecting family time is part of creating a workplace culture that values human dignity. The conversation represented everything that was changing about Summit Airlines. Under the previous ownership, Carmen's concerns about childcare would have been seen as a liability. Under Zara's leadership, they were seen as an opportunity to build a more inclusive and supportive workplace. Tyler Morrison was experiencing similar conversations with corporate representatives who were outlining his accelerated career path. The culture that had punished him for speaking up was being replaced by one that rewarded moral courage and principled leadership. Amanda Foster was fielding calls from news networks who wanted to interview her about the incident she had documented. Her marketing expertise was suddenly in high demand from organizations that wanted to understand how corporate crises could unfold so rapidly in the social media age. The ripple effects extended into the broader aviation industry as well. Other airlines were reviewing their policies, training programs, and complaint procedures in response to the viral incident. The speed and decisiveness of Zara's response had created a new standard for corporate accountability that competitors would need to match. Flight SA-892 finally pushed back from the gate 3 hours after its scheduled departure time, but no passenger complained about the delay. They understood they had witnessed something historic, and many would later describe it as the most meaningful flight of their lives. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Zara looked out the window at the black SUV where Torres had waited patiently during the crisis. Soon he would brief the legal teams, coordinate with investigators, and manage the media response that would shape how this story was remembered. But for now, in the quiet moments before takeoff, Zara reflected on the lesson she had learned. Discrimination thrived in darkness, in private moments when victims had no voice and no power to demand justice. But in the age of social media, with cameras everywhere and instant global communication, darkness was becoming harder to maintain. Blake's career was over. Jessica's reputation was destroyed. Thornfield's business empire was crumbling. But their consequences were just the beginning of a larger transformation that would reshape how corporate America treated every customer who walked through their doors. The plane rose into the sky carrying 312 passengers who would never forget what they had witnessed. And below them, in airports and corporate offices across the country, executives were asking themselves a crucial question. If this could happen to Summit Airlines, what hidden discrimination existed in their own organizations? The age of digital accountability had arrived, and there was no going back. 6 months after Flight SA-892 changed everything. Zara Mitchell stood in the gleaming headquarters of Summit Airlines in Atlanta, looking out at a company that bore little resemblance to the organization she had acquired. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough, principled, and deeply personal for everyone involved. The conference room where she was meeting with her leadership team was diverse in ways that would have been impossible under the previous management. Carmen Rodriguez sat at the table as Director of Passenger Advocacy, her daughter Sophia playing quietly in the corner with toys from the on-site child care center that had become a model for corporate family support. Tyler Morrison, now Assistant Director of Flight Operations at 26, was presenting the quarterly Customer Satisfaction Report. Customer complaints are down 89% from the same period last year, he announced. More importantly, discrimination complaints have been eliminated entirely. Our new training protocols are working. The training protocols Tyler referenced had become the gold standard for the aviation industry. Every Summit Airlines employee, from executives to ground crew, underwent mandatory dignity and respect education that used Blake's behavior as a case study in everything an airline employee should never do. Amanda Foster, who had parlayed her viral documentation into a position as Director of Digital Ethics, presented her report on social media monitoring and crisis prevention. We're tracking customer feedback in real time across all platforms, she explained. Any incident that suggests discrimination triggers immediate investigation and response. Her live stream of the original incident had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms, becoming one of the most watched corporate accountability moments in social media history. She had used that visibility to advocate for digital transparency and corporate responsibility throughout the business world. Captain Maria Santos, now Chief of Flight Operations, delivered the safety and operational report. Our pilots are reporting higher job satisfaction and better passenger relationships since implementing the Dignity First protocols. When crew members treat passengers with respect, it creates a positive atmosphere that benefits everyone. The Dignity First protocols had eliminated the arbitrary power that captains like Blake had wielded over passengers. Clear policies, consistent enforcement, and accountability measures ensured that no passenger would ever again be humiliated for failing to meet someone else's expectations about who belonged in first class. But the most emotional moment came when Zara addressed the room about the broader impact of their work. 6 months ago, I was handcuffed on my own aircraft for the crime of sitting while black in first class. Today, we've created an airline where that could never happen to anyone. The statement carried weight beyond its corporate implications. Summit Airlines had become proof that businesses could be both profitable and principled, that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, but economically smart. The financial results supported Zara's philosophy completely. Despite the initial cost of reforms investigations and legal settlements, Summit Airlines was more profitable than ever. Customer loyalty had increased dramatically. Employee satisfaction was at record highs, and the company's reputation attracted top talent from across the industry. Carmen Rodriguez had used her social work background to create passenger advocacy programs that other airlines were scrambling to copy. Every passenger complaint is investigated by someone who understands discrimination from personal experience, she explained to the room. We don't just resolve problems, we prevent them by addressing the cultural attitudes that create them. Her work had expanded beyond Summit Airlines as well. Carmen had testified before Congress about discrimination in the transportation industry, had spoken at civil rights conferences, and had become a national advocate for passenger dignity and corporate accountability. The consequences for the original perpetrators had been as permanent as Zara had predicted. Derek Blake never flew commercially again. His pilot license had been permanently revoked by the FAA after a thorough investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning his entire career. He was working as a ground instructor at a small flight school in rural Georgia, earning a fraction of his former salary, and living with the knowledge that his prejudices had destroyed everything he had built. Jessica Hayes had been unable to find work in the aviation industry. Airlines conducted thorough background checks that always uncovered her role in the false arrest incident. She was working in retail customer service, a daily reminder of how quickly careers could end when employees chose discrimination over dignity. Marcus Thornfield's real estate empire had collapsed within 6 months of the incident. Business partners had abandoned him, clients had terminated contracts, and the viral documentation of his entitled behavior had made him toxic to anyone who cared about corporate reputation. He was facing personal bankruptcy and multiple lawsuits from former business associates. But Zara wasn't focused on their destruction. She was building something better from the lessons their behavior had taught her. The industry-wide changes had been remarkable. The Federal Aviation Administration had implemented new regulations requiring discrimination reporting and response protocols at all airlines. Other companies had adopted similar dignity-first training programs. Corporate executives throughout America were asking themselves whether their own organizations could survive the kind of real-time accountability that social media now enabled. Tyler Morrison had become a speaker at aviation industry conferences, sharing his experience of choosing courage over compliance. "I learned that staying silent when you witness injustice makes you complicit in that injustice," he would tell audiences of airline employees. Speaking up might seem risky, but enabling discrimination is far more dangerous for everyone involved. His career trajectory had become an inspiration for young employees throughout the industry who were learning that moral courage was rewarded rather than punished in organizations with authentic leadership. As the meeting concluded, Zara walked through the headquarters observing the culture they had created together. Employees from diverse backgrounds worked collaboratively on teams that would have been segregated under the previous management. The executive suite included leaders who looked like the customers they served. The company policies were posted prominently, emphasizing respect, dignity, and accountability above profit margins and VIP preferences. She paused at a framed copy of the company's new mission statement written in the weeks following the incident. Summit Airlines exists to connect people and communities with dignity, respect, and excellence. Every passenger, regardless of appearance, background, or economic status, deserves to be treated as our most valued guest. The statement wasn't just corporate messaging. It was lived reality enforced at every level of the organization. Later that evening, Zara received a call that brought the transformation full circle. Officer Patricia Santos, the airport security supervisor who had arrested her on Flight SA-892, had requested a meeting. They met at a coffee shop near the airport, two women whose lives had been changed by 18 minutes of documented injustice and its aftermath. Ms. Mitchell Santos began, her voice heavy with emotion. "I've wanted to apologize for months. I knew that arrest felt wrong, but I let authority override my instincts. I'm sorry." Zara looked across the table at the woman who had put handcuffs on her, seeing not an enemy, but another victim of a culture that rewarded compliance over conscience. Patricia Zara replied, using the officer's first name deliberately, "You were in an impossible situation. An airline captain was demanding arrest. Your partner was supporting him, and you were caught between following orders and following your heart." Santos wiped away tears she had been holding back for months. "I should have refused. I should have known better." "You did know better," Zara said gently. "I could see it in your eyes. You were uncomfortable from the moment you arrived. The culture failed you as much as it failed me." The conversation continued for over an hour, two women processing the trauma and transformation that had emerged from one moment of corporate injustice. Santos had undergone additional training on civil rights and discrimination recognition. She had become an advocate within airport security for more careful evaluation of discrimination complaints. "I want you to know," Santos said as they prepared to leave, "that incident changed how I approach every situation. I ask harder questions now. I trust my instincts more. I won't enable discrimination again." Zara smiled warmly. "That's the real victory, Patricia. Not the punishments or the corporate changes, but the individual choices people make to be better." As Zara drove home that night, she reflected on the journey from handcuffs to transformation. The incident on Flight SA-892 had been painful, humiliating, and infuriating, but it had also been necessary. A moment when hidden prejudices were exposed to the harsh light of accountability, creating opportunities for change that might not have existed otherwise. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Carmen Rodriguez. Sophia said her first airplane word today. Dignity. I think you'd be proud. Zara smiled, understanding that the real measure of their success wouldn't be found in quarterly reports or industry awards, but in the next generation of children who would grow up in a world where dignity was expected rather than revolutionary. The story that began with discrimination and false arrest had become something much larger. Proof that injustice documented was injustice defeated, and that corporate accountability was possible when leadership chose courage over convenience. Flight SA-892 had landed safely, carrying its passengers not just to their destinations, but into a future where respect was standard, dignity was guaranteed, and justice was just 18 minutes away. If this story moved, you remember that dignity isn't negotiable, and respect isn't earned by appearance or status. It's owed to every human being simply because they exist. The next time you witness injustice, remember Zara's courage and Patricia's growth. Document the truth, speak up for what's right, and never let anyone tell you where you don't belong. This story proves that one moment of courage can change everything. When we stand up for justice, when we refuse to accept discrimination, when we use our voices and our cameras to expose the truth, we create a world where everyone can fly with dignity. If you believe that respect should be universal and justice shouldn't depend on who you know or what you own, then this channel is for you. Hit that like button if this story gave you chills of justice. Subscribe and ring the notification bell, because we're building a community of people who refuse to stay silent when they witness injustice. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who's ever been told they don't belong. Share it with someone who has the power to make change in their workplace or community. Because stories like this don't just entertain us, they inspire us to be better. In the comments below, tell us about a time when you witnessed injustice. Tell us about a time when someone stood up for what was right. Or tell us about changes you want to see in the world around you. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together we can make sure that the age of accountability isn't just a moment, it's a movement. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And remember, justice is just one brave person away. Until next time, keep standing up, keep speaking out, and never forget that dignity is a right, not a privilege.